Hello and welcome to the SCI-AI Podcast. This is episode number 22. Today, my guest is Asim Iqbal. He's a machine learning scientist and ex-Googler. And for the introduction, I've left it to him. So welcome to the podcast, Asim. Why don't you introduce yourself to all of us?
Thanks a lot, Vivek. It's a pleasure to join your podcast. And a quick summary about myself. I'm Asim Iqbal. I'm a machine learning scientist. I did my master's and PhD in computational neuroscience from University of Zurich and ETH Zurich in Switzerland. And previously, I have a background in electrical engineering as well. And I spent some time doing research on the intersection of artificial intelligence and neuroscience at various places such as MIT. I worked as a visiting researcher for a while, and then I spent some time with IBM and more recently with Google, as you mentioned. And then I also spent some time doing my postdoctoral research at EPFL in Switzerland. And yeah, what excites me the most is actually to take inspiration from neuroscience and to apply it to AI and vice versa. So I'm glad we are speaking today.
Fantastic. Yes. And purposefully, I have kept the theme of our podcast as neuroscience and AI because I believe that, they are meant for each other. Without one of them, the other one would not prosper, at least when we are building the most human level kind of intelligence in machines. All right. So thank you for that introduction. And let's go ahead and get started with some of the topics we have for you. So do you think that AI and neuroscience builds this symbiotic relationship to help excel the other in simplifying each other? How does neuroscience help in creating human-like brain interface for AI? As humans, we can tackle complexity and uncertainty when dealt with a problem. How difficult or easy it is to add that feature to an AI algorithm? Is it possible by building or mimicking the brain structure, or how do you see it?
Sure, I think it's a fantastic question. So coming back to the first point of your question, I think there is a lot of room to actually find synergy between neuroscience and AI. For instance, the huge wave that came into AI probably like a decade ago, and it was mostly like convolutional neural networks that just worked magically on large-scale data sets. Although neural networks have been, there since a while, but we haven't heard too much about them and so on and so forth, that their impact in the application side has not been too drastic. So what magically happened there, I believe, is actually, and probably this is one of the foundations of convolutional neural networks as well, is if we go back to the findings of a few famous Nobel laureates, neuroscientists such as Hubel and Wiesel, who discovered two kinds of cells in primate visual cortex. They did some experiments on cat visual cortex. And they discovered two kinds of cells, which is, they named it simple and complex cells. And their functionality actually mimics quite similar to what we find in the artificial kernels or the feature detectors in the convolutional neural networks. Mm-hmm. And if we try to actually, write down the maths as well, that how actually that feature processing is done, it's insanely similar, actually. And so you can imagine like the basis of high-performing deep neural networks today is actually coming from inspiration from neuroscience. So, and this is just one part of like the bigger picture. The other part is actually how do these networks learn, right? So there's quite some similarity there as well. For instance, back propagation. People have reported it's happening on a single neural level as well. And we know like deep neural networks actually need back propagation to actually train on a data set. So So there is some inspiration there as well. And now with reinforcement learning and more towards deep reinforcement learning, should I say, there is also quite some similarity between the principles of reinforcement learning is actually emerging from learning from the brain or something. So you can imagine like all the applications that we see in the real world today, it has a lot of synergy. Like inspiration is coming from neuroscience on a high level. But I wouldn't call it like all neuroscience, to be honest. I think there is a huge effort coming from statistical, computer science, mathematics, and machine learning community, to actually be able to make those models work at the end of the day, and to actually outperform on several real-world tasks. I think there is a lot of effort from the community there. And coming to the second part of your question, I believe that how can actually like brain-machine interface, for instance, how this could be the case by taking inspiration from both. I think from a neuroscience perspective, I think I can say it on some level that we are still trying to crack the code, what's happening in the brain. It's not like that we have deciphered, the computational principles in the brain. We are on way there. There is some time. So part of the reason is because brain is a very complex organ, and it has so much stuff happening, anatomically speaking, functionally speaking. And it's not like the same neuron. Let's just focus on a single neuron. We have like millions of neurons in our brain, but it's not like the same neuron always behaves similarly, when presented as similar stimulus, So you can imagine like there are some common principles of computation across brain, but there aren't as well. So what computation neuroscientists try to do is actually try to understand the role of individual neurons and also try to understand the role of population of neurons, right? And then they try to actually take this inspiration that how can we actually explain population of neurons through some deep neural networks, right? So one of the labs that I actually previously worked with at MIT, they did quite some work on actually collecting data from monkeys' visual cortex, and by presenting different images, like natural images, and then recording from a population of neurons in the visual cortex. And they actually did something similar by presenting the same images that they presented the monkey to a deep neural network. And they actually record from different units or neurons of a deep neural network. And what they actually try to do, they try to actually explain the variance in the neural data with actually this artificial responses that they collected from the neural networks. And they actually do find that there is quite some similarity between population level neural responses and population level responses from the neural networks as well. Now, in this direction, you can imagine like on at least from a monkey or a primate perspective, that we are able to capture the complexity of a population of neurons. So for instance, like we can predict to a certain level that what actually the mouse is looking at, in terms of a decoding task, for instance. And if we can understand that by looking at the neural responses, then it actually means that we are able to capture the complexity of the neural data through this high-performing deep neural networks, which actually becomes which sets the perfect stage for sort of like brain-computer interface, for instance. Then what it means actually that we can learn the pattern of the spiking neural responses, and we can learn that from neural network as well. And then if a neural network detects a signal from the brain, that can be collected from different sensors. I don't know if you're familiar with like EEG sensors or EEG caps.
Yes.
You may have seen people.
The EEG, yeah.
So for instance, what they do is actually they record these sort of like, those are not neural responses, but those are like high-level responses, which are emerging from population immune responses. And people there's quite some work where people try to actually predict those responses through deep neural networks as well. Right? Now, in that sense, you can imagine like there is quite some interesting work that is happening in that side, which is going to become the basis of like very fine, brain-machine interfaces in the near future. Although this field has been there since a while now, and part of the reason you can imagine, like people like Elon Musk is actually, working on it through Neuralink, and there are other startups as well which are trying to actually now take these ideas from academic perspective, from academic labs to actually industrialize them by finding some interesting applications. So there's a lot of interesting things happening on the both sides, and where both fields have a lot of room to learn and grow from each other, I believe.
How does a neural network learns? Because you talked about, creating it with the brain model and, the prefrontal cortex, of the mice and putting those EEGs on the headset. But how does a neural network then learns? Is it by saving data? Is it by, intelligent algorithm that's there? Or is it by experiencing things by, different senses? Or so yeah, what do you think about it?
So when you say neural network, do you mean the neural network in the brain, or are you referring towards neural network, artificial neural network?
Right. Let's start with the biological brain.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So there are different principles through which actually neurons learn, and the primary thing is like in one case you need data to actually learn, which means you need some stimulus actually to learn. And then in some cases, you don't need stimulus as well, right? I will try to explain both of these categories as well. But on a simplest level, you can imagine like a single neuron in the brain. Let's talk about visual cortex, which is the area where most of the visual processing is done. In that region, although you have so many neurons, but for a single neuron is connected to a lot of other neurons. In some cases, thousands and thousands of neurons. Now, if I'm a neuron and sitting somewhere in between different regions, then actually I have some input connections and I have some output connections to the other neurons. Now, I'm receiving input connections from other neurons, and I'm also actually sending my output signal to other neurons as well, through which I'm connected, right? And you can imagine something similar when you think of like a high-level model of artificial neural network. You see those input layers, you see those hidden layers, and you see those output layers as well, where most of them are, connected with each other. Now, let's say if I present an image, and let's say this neuron spikes, which is connected to a lot of neurons from the input and output. Now, in that sense, what it actually means for that single neuron is that it has a preferred stimulus, what we just presented, right? And let's say we present another image, then that neuron does not spike, which actually means like we had a preferred stimulus, which is the previous image or the previous stimulus. And if we look at that previous image as well, then we can try to find what is interesting in that image, which means, is there any specific features in that image which that neuron is sensitive to? Could those be edges oriented at different angles? Or could those be anything else as well, for instance?
Right.
Now, the way this learning is happening is, there is a very famous postulate in neuroscience called House postulate. It's called those who sort of like wire together, fire together, or those who fire together, wire together. What it actually means is two neurons, they share their spiking behavior with each other, then they actually strongly wire and connect with each other as well. And the way that, and this is actually a very strong postulate of learning, because what it happens is, if my input neuron is actually giving me a signal, and if I respond to that neuron by selecting it from thousands of other neurons, that actually means that my learning is wired specifically to that neuron. So I'm going to listen to that neuron more preferably to any other neuron, for instance, right? But this is like a very high level sort of idiotic example that I'm trying to give to actually grasp the bigger picture. Yeah. But now you can imagine there are so many different kinds of neurons in the brain. Right? There are excitatory neurons, there are inhibitory neurons, and those have further subtypes as well. And at the moment we are talking about individual neurons, now there are neural circuits as well. Neurons that are connected to other neurons, and those are actually just population of neurons responding to some stimulus. Right? So you can imagine like such principles. What I just tried to describe is called these are called synaptic plasticity rules of learning. And on a high level, this is mostly found everywhere in the brain. There's these rules of like synaptic plasticity learning, and they can either make the connection stronger, so the learning stronger, or this could actually make the connections weaker as well. Because if the neuron fires before me, the input neuron, then there is a strong sort of connection. But if it responds after me, then the connection becomes weak. And there's a lot of science inside the neuron why it is happening this way. But you can imagine, like on a single neuron level, there's a very systematic way that the learning is happening, and this trickles down to the population level at the whole as well.
So it's a collection of how the neurons connect with each other and what kind of communication is happening, and a lot of data transfer as well.
True. So you mentioned data, but one thing that I didn't mention a lot in the last answer was I took it as an example of a single image, right? But you can imagine like throughout the day we look at like infinite images as our visual stream, right? And this is just talking about the visual information, but there is an auditory information as well, and olfactory information and whatnot, and especially sensory information.
Right.
And in that sense, you can imagine like now maybe I can use a TWI model of a neural network, artificial neural network, to explain what's happening in the brain as well. So we spoke about a single image, a neuron respond to, but then you can imagine like we start feeding so many images to that single neuron or to a population of neurons. And then they actually themselves become tuned to some preferred stimulus or preferred features, right? So a specific neuron, let's say, is preferred to a horizontal sort of like horizontal edge detector, for instance, something like this, right? Now, whenever those neurons are going to look at any image which has those features in it, those neurons are going to respond, right? And this happens over time, because you're going to keep presenting the images, and then the neurons actually make their preference. And it's not like the specific neurons actually just going to have all the horizontal edge detectors. They're becoming all the visual space, right? And this is just a tiny example of a single pixel level, for instance, that I'm mentioning. But you can imagine, like when you look at a complex natural image, such as a face, for instance, then we have eyes, we have nose, we have ears, and whatnot. And in that sense, if we go to the individual level on a pixel level, then those actually are edges, right? So a population of neurons that we just talked about is actually focused on detecting those edges, whereas the next population, as we go further down in the ventral stream, are actually having a bigger receptive field, which is looking at the complete eye now, right, and the complete nose and the complete face. And it is fascinating that it is quite similar to what is happening in today's deep neural network as well. Because as you trickle down deeper in the network towards sort of like the final classification layers, on a high level, this is what's happening as well. Initially, you have smaller receptive fields, and then you actually encompass the large features. And yes, I hope it answers to some extent.
Yes, it does. So yeah, great answer. Thank you. Right. So my next question is, can artificial intelligence actually accelerate the research of neuroscientific research, like finding mental cure and help people with disabilities, building movement capability for them? What do you think?
Absolutely. I think, so to answer the first part of your question, one thing is like that how AI is facilitating neuroscience today is, for instance, I would describe it on two levels. One is now AI-based methods or tools are actually being utilized by a lot of neuroscientists to actually analyze their data sets, right? And this could happen that, for instance, if you want to segment or detect a single neuron in complex images collected from a variety of species and different brain regions, there's like a lot of variability morphologically, anatomically in the data. Now we know, like, for instance, deep neural networks are pretty great in object classification and segmentation tasks, and those are deployed effectively in analyzing such large-scale data sets as well. And this is just one example. There are other models, for instance, which are analyzing the behavior of the animal as well through key point estimation. Now, coming to sort of like finding a cure for some common diseases, I think in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of development on that front, especially using machine learning and AI. And there are quite a few companies or startups that are found, especially in the Bay Area, which are actually just using AI for drug discovery, right? And they have secured some decent amount of funding as well. Now, you can imagine like why these companies are emerging now as compared to 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Because now one can understand that AI has reached to a capacity where all you need is some good structured data to train your models. And once you have that, then sky is your limit, right? Then in that aspect, imagine that you collect the data from certain labs or from certain hospitals, which can actually, or trained doctors can actually give you some smart labels that, you know what, I believe by looking at this image or data sample that this person has, let's say, severe depression or dementia or any other disease that we can take as an example. And then now you can take those labeled examples and train a neural network, which actually can predict with high precision and accuracy that by looking at the data of a new patient as an instance. Now, such technique could be very useful, you can imagine, when we are talking about millions of patients every day, right? And especially, I think probably 2 weeks ago, DeepMind just announced that they are actually making a new company. Its founder is making a new company called Isomorphic Labs, which is just using AI for drug discovery. Now, you can imagine like a player like DeepMind is also realizing that it is a huge field which has a lot of room, right, to grow. And now, and this is the right time to actually make it happen. So I guess AI is actually helping a lot as of today, and I think probably in the near future it's going to be really helpful in hopefully finding some cure for outstanding diseases.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Right. So the next one is, what are the cognitive and behavioral parameters that enable an individual to successfully control a brain control interface?
So imagine so if we talk about cognition or mind, I believe it's the highest form of the response that you can imagine from neural networks.
Sure.
And on a single neuron level, we had a good discussion just now that how neurons respond. Now, if you think about brain-machine interface, for instance, you can imagine the main module that needs to be there is actually try to decipher how a single neuron, preferably, or a population of neurons respond for a specific stimulus when presented, or for any output task as well. So let's say if I take as an input a visual image, and my response to that will be in the form of a hand gesture, let's say something like this, then I take the sensory information as input and I actually respond through a motor output. Right? Now, if we look at the motor activity, then it actually starts from the brain, but it goes through our nerves, right? And there's most of the brain machine interfaces as well. They put both the EEG caps as well, where they try to detect the signals from the brain. And more recently, actually, there is a lot of work which actually try to detect the signals of the motor output through our neurons, motor neurons present in our wrist, for instance. For people who are interested, there is a startup which is actually acquired by Facebook now, or Meta now, which is called Control Labs, which actually does that, where you can control devices through your sort of like a band in a wristband, which has a lot of sensors. Now, on a high level, you can imagine such applications where they're trying to build is you can imagine a virtual keyboard, for instance, right? So you are typing, but there isn't any keyboard, but you can actually see your types, because you can decipher individual fingers and their motor activity. And now, if we take both the information together, which is the input and the output, so we take the sensory information as input and output, then you can imagine on a high level what is happening is our mind is actually trying to generate a sense of the external environment and learning to actually respond through some motor activity, right? Now, in that sense, you can imagine that cognitively speaking, initially it may not be straightforward for us to actually, understand that brain-machine computer interface as a natural thing. But since our mind is so plastic, over time as we learn, over time as we interact with these devices, I think there is a natural modulation that is expected to occur, right? Not only for people who actually really need to rely on brain-machine computer interface for any disease reason, or any of their handicaps, for instance, but especially for people who want to control devices for day-to-day tasks, for instance, which we just discussed as controlling a keyboard, as an example. Now, I believe that there is still time to actually see that, because those devices are out there, but we don't see many people using them today. But there is a hope that this will happen more in the near future. And what effects and would it make on our cognition and mind, and how would we actually naturally move through this phase of transition? I think this is something that we will learn more over time.
So connected to that is a topic which is a bit controversial, but I don't know, also have some merit. Do you believe in psychedelics? Can you talk about it? Like hypnosis, etc. Can you go into psychedelic state for some time and come out of it? So basically, where I'm trying to get onto is that under our control or not? So when the brain goes into that kind of state, it's out of control, and then by chance, by an accident, it comes back to reality.
It's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on psychedelics, as you may know, but I can try to give my 2 cents.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, like, there primarily, if I understand correctly, there are two ways to actually go into a psychedelic state. For instance, one is you can take some specific drugs, right, that target specific neurotransmitters in your brain in a specific region. And then the other form could be that what people have reported is by reaching some sort of like mystical levels, or, through some mystical experiences as well, people try to, like, report that they have reached that state as well. Now, I think one of the effects of such states is that you actually start hallucinating, and you hallucinate visuals. For instance, you can see people that you normally do not see, or which are not there, or you may hear as well things that do not exist, but in your mind's high dimension, you actually perceive them as they are in reality. So you can imagine a psychedelic state, in my 2 cents are that it's somewhere where you're confusing imagination with reality, and sort of like vice versa. Now, such form of state, you can think of like you can think the effects of such states in two ways. One is that you can imagine, like, if you reach to that state through some input drugs, then what it actually means, you are changing the wiring of your neurons in your brain, right? And through changing those wirings through some external drug is actually making you reach that state. And the other way is, let's say, you practicing through learning this by yourself, which, for instance, could happen through some, I don't know, spiritual experiences people have reported, or try to actually practice those mystical experiences, or I don't know. So one can totally reach to that level, but then coming out of it is another transition, I believe. And I can't say much about how neuroscience would take on it, because it is like, as you can imagine, like, for instance, hallucinations is an after effect of something that happened in your brain. So it's not a reality per se, but it's actually what you imagine, right? Now, in that sense, you can think of it as an artifact in your reality, right? But you, while in that state, actually would call it a reality, right? Because you are in it. Now, it is interesting that that you yourself could actually reach to a state where you can start confusing between the two, right? And I don't know much about how neuroscience have. I'm sure, like, especially psychologists must have, like, experienced and worked on it quite a lot. But I don't think that neuroscience has a lot of work recently on this subject. I don't know.
Right. No, but great answer. Great point of view. Right. So as a neuroscientist, according to you, what is consciousness? This is a repeatable sort of question that I ask from all my guests and researchers. And of course, it is one of the topics that is the most complex and the most talked about in the world today. Nobody knows what it is, but as per you, as per a neuroscientist, what is to you consciousness is, and why did evolution sort of chose us to make us sentient, and why not other beings such as plants or, other things?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and as you rightly mentioned, that it is a very hot topic these days, and
Right.
especially like a lot of big names more recently in neuroscience have actually started exploring on this subject as well. Now, and I would try to like draw a very simple example of explaining what I
Sure.
believe is consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, think of like a robot that you actually design yourself, and you draw some specific rules that you implement in that robot. For instance, just follow a white line, while you are walking. Take right, when you see a green signal. Take left when you see a red signal. And then one day, this robot actually does something new, which you have not taught that robot, for instance, right? Which, for example, the robot stops following the white line and stops, following the right direction when it sees the green signal. It actually starts going the other way around, and it starts exploring something new as well. And imagine what could happen if that robot you actually start. One day is actually, you can imagine like doing other tasks, such as complex tasks, let's say washing dishes, which you have not taught that robot. Right? Now, what is happening there is like, there is some material behind it. There is some sort of like matter behind it, and there is an underlying software which is running on it that you actually coded. And you can imagine like the robot must follow the specific rules that you design that algorithm with, and should not do anything else. Right? Now, with us as humans, you can imagine like in our case that we have a brain in which has neurons and quite some other stuff, which is the hardware of our brain, which is the hardware, let's say. And then there is a running software on it, which, for instance, is the neural networks, right, the processing, the learning, the sensory information, and then which leads to what we call as cognition or mind. Right? Now, consciousness, I believe, is the highest form of state of that cognition and mind, where we are actually doing things that which are way above and beyond to what we have learned from the data, or to what our neurons are hard coded with as a software. Right? Now, you can imagine, like, let's say, we experience things day to day, where, bless you. So there are two
Excuse me.
levels to it. No, yeah. One is that you can imagine like we experience day-to-day things, which is, let's say you and I take a ride on a train, and we sit next to a window, and let's say we are going from Zurich to Geneva, and there are some beautiful views out there. And we actually see those beautiful mountains, and then we ask each other, can we describe that experience? Right? Now, my subjective experience is going to be different than yours, although we were looking at the exact same thing.
Same thing.
We were looking at the exact same thing. Now, what it actually means is like of course, it has to do with our previous learning as well, the way our brain is tuned already with past experiences as well. Right. What it actually means is like the emergent new responses and the experiences are still very different. But even for people, let's say, with absolute same past experiences, hypothetically speaking. Now, this is very interesting. What it actually means is like, you can imagine that there are thousands of ways to do a certain job. And let's say it is randomly chosen by a single brain to actually do it for some way, and then the other brain actually randomly selects to do it the other way. And almost always, this is different, right? So there isn't a case where you actually share the same conscious experience together, right? That is unheard of. And I believe in that sense, you can imagine like we as human beings are conscious, or by evolution has actually selected us this way. This we can imagine like by comparing ourselves with plants, for instance, and other species. Now, through a neuroscience perspective, you can imagine like there is some common there is the minimum baseline items that needs to be there for one to be conscious, right? So that baseline could be, for instance, that we have a higher cognition functions as individuals. We have a lot of neurons. So there has to be a reason that we have so many neurons in our brain. We have so many sensors as vision, auditory, and then so on. So there has to be a reason that, the evolution has selected us, that, we have these sensors. So there is an underlying baseline that needs to be there when it comes to anatomy and certain functionality, right? Where the consciousness is a possibility. And when we look at the plants, for instance, then they may not have evolved to that level. Part of the reason is like their role throughout those evolutionary experiences has been limited to a certain functionality with certain neurons or certain cell types, which are doing certain. For instance, they also take sensory information as input, right? So they take sunlight, they take water, right? And they actually respond as well towards the environment, similar to what we respond to. We take some information from the environment and then we respond. So, for instance, they sort of like release oxygen and then they take up the carbon dioxide. That's one function, and then they actually produce out as an output fruits as well. That's another function. So they multiply, right? And there are certain functionalities. If we look at we as human conscious beings and plants, there are some common things as well as inputs and outputs to high level. But then when we draw the basic distinction between like the underlying anatomical and role of specific regions in our brain and the amount of neurons and connections that we have is altogether different than as we compare to plants or anything else for that matter, any non-living being. So I believe you can imagine like initially this whole evolutionary experience has been subjective to like as sort of like keep on pruning and keep on selecting sort of like, with competition or whichever way we can call it. But over time, the most conscious beings that we know as we are have actually emerged as the ones who are actually doing these amazing things in the world. And part of the reason is that we have this specific advantage to us, which is a certain brain size and specific number of neurons and connections as well. But it doesn't always mean that the amount of neurons and connections is proportional to how conscious you are and how intelligent you are, for instance, because there are other beings as well, like elephants, for instance, and whales. True. They have such huge brains, far more huge than humans, for instance, right? But are they more intelligent being than us? That's a different discussion. But we can think of that nature has selected through a systematic way of like categorizing species in a certain way, where although we were selected as through this competition in a certain way, but at the same time, I believe there is some underlying baseline functionality that we had, that actually we emerge as beings who actually could go towards consciousness as an experience, as compared to the other species, I believe. I don't know. Maybe it does give you a flavor. I'm not an expert on consciousness.
But whatever you said is fantastic, because you're right. I mean, there needs to be some baseline wherein, it topples, wherein it decides whether somebody is conscious or not.
Yeah.
Like you said, and it also doesn't depend on the brain size. I mean, elephant, whales, so many huge animals, they have bigger brains than us, but it's not the size of the brain that matters. Perhaps it's the right kind of neurons. Perhaps it's kind of the right kind of neural networks inside the brain that actually makes you conscious. It's the kind of senses that comes together. Like you said, we are both viewing the same mountain, but our subjective experience is completely different. And none is wrong or right. It's just that we as a species can interpret it in two different ways or many different ways. But perhaps an elephant or perhaps any other animal who doesn't seem to be conscious might not be able to interpret it differently among their own species. So just fascinating stuff. And that's the reason why I thought that I should ask this question to you.
I'm glad you did.
Great. Right. So next question is a little bit connected to it. What is reality? Is it our brain's perception? I have read and heard in some programs of it that if our brain is switched off or doesn't exist, then nothing around us exists. So is it a subjective experience, or do you think that we're just thinking too much into it and reality is just the way we see it?
Very interesting question. I would actually like to answer it by start quoting. I read something in a book once. I think it was maybe it was Stephen Hawking who said it, but I'm not sure.
Right.
But I think it was what was described in that book was that actually, like, quite some time ago, when people started making small aquariums for fish, they were not being very selective with the shape of the glass, right? When they selected. So they could use triangle as a shape, they could use square as a shape, And then one day they realized that, like when you are inside a triangle shape and when you look at the outside world, it's actually not how exactly it is, right? It's very different. And then onward, they actually start making it as a bowl, right? As a sphere, where the fish could actually look at the reality of the outside world, similar to the way it actually is the reality. Now, you can imagine in that sense, like, let's say, what if I say, we are living in a box. Let's call it our subjective experience, which is a triangle.
Right.
Now that our reality is in that sense, is it actually the reality? Because there needs to be a sphere for us to look at the right reality. Now, but I think it's a good example to actually be open and realistic to the point that what we define as a reality, as a subjective experience, it could be different for other species and other beings and other individuals as well. Right? Now, reality, as you mentioned, is a subjective experience. It's an individual's experience. As long as you can actually explain it through your physical experiences, I believe this is closest to the reality that we live in. Right? At least there has to be some common consensus that we, as humans, let's say, define reality as a single entity. Now, in those physical experiences that we could mention is something very simple, such as we can define that this is a glass bottle, and for me it is a
Right.
glass bottle, and for you it is a glass bottle as well, right?
Right.
Now, but there are other things that you would define as a reality, but I may actually disagree. For instance, you could say, you know what, that if you do this and this, then you will achieve this and this in your life, right? Whereas your experience of that reality would be different than my experience. My experience says that, you know what, no, this is not how it happens. You need to have certain different experiences to actually be able to reach to a certain point, right? Which you can imagine, like how much you need to study to actually land a perfect job in your field, right? Do you need to study like day and night? But there are other people who actually doesn't study that much, but they actually reach to that level, right? I'm just trying to use this example to explain that
Right.
many of the diverse experiences of our lives actually, what we define as reality is very different from the other individuals, right? Based on our experiences. And in that sense, then reality is a subjective experience, right? Let's say there is your reality. There is my reality, right? But in that reality, of course, there is something common. And most of us have, let's say, 90% or maybe more common parts, same as reality that we define, which is the common intersection. And there are other experiences that we define it. These are my subjective experiences, and this is my reality to it, right? Which could be different from individuals and even population of other people as well, right? And now coming to the point where you mentioned, like, what happens if we, switch off the brain, right? Does the world end here? I mean, for us, let's say if someone switch off my brain right now, then for me, the world ends there, right? I believe. Like, there isn't any reality that exists. I mean, this world as a reality is closed for me. It's over.
Right.
I do not have a subjective experience of this world. So I cannot claim a subjective experience afterwards, right? Because I'm not in it, in a way. So my reality will be whatever form I will be once my brain is switched off, right?
Right.
Whether it could be some non-conscious form, or whether, it could be some form which is combination of somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness leading to something. And in that realm, you can imagine that since the reality is our individual experiences, as through our brain. So once our brain is not working, then actually the reality does not work as well, right? Now one can actually argue that what I'm saying is like, so what happens when we watch, when we see dreams, right? Or what happens to people who are in coma, for instance, right? Do they dream or not, for instance, right?
Right.
But again, my point will be that is not reality, right? That is their imagination.
Right.
So, for instance, in their imagination, they would be flying planes and aeroplanes, and in reality, they cannot, right? So in as long as we are conscious, right, and we do not have, let's say, as long as we are conscious, then we can actually have our real experiences. And somewhere in between, if we are not having a sort of like a dreamless sleep as well, right? Which we can identify as like an unconscious state. There, I believe, is we can high level categorize that our reality is different now. Our reality is over from this subjective world experiences, and it has led to something else, right?
Right. So great answer. So the gist of it, how I understand it, is we create our own realities. So if the brain's switched off, if the brain isn't present, you are not creating a reality for yourself. So yeah, people can say that, once a person dies, he cannot think or do anything, but the world keeps going on, and that's real. So that means that, you as an entity, in order to understand reality, you need to be conscious. We are going in circles again about consciousness, but like you said, you need to be conscious also in order to understand reality. Otherwise, to a plant or to certain animals, they do not understand it. I mean, they're living because, evolution chose them to live in that certain way, but they cannot comprehend reality because of the fact that they're not conscious. So, yeah, but great answer, great discussion.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would like to add that, let's say,
Sure.
someone who has passed on, from our reality to something else, then for that individual, let's say that the reality as we call it is over. Maybe for that individual, it would be that they would say, now we are in our reality, and what we were previously were in was our imagination.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you then. So my next question to you is, how does AI help understand our brains? As we all know, the human body is a complex structure of atoms and molecules that create organs, cells, tissues, body vessels, blood vessels, neurons, glands, and several other components, right? So how does AI create models and predictive cognitive architectures to help us learn about ourselves better?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So as I mentioned in one of my previous answers to one of the questions, where people more recently have started actually finding correlation between the neural responses and as well as like the artificial neuron responses from neural networks. And they seem to find quite some similarity on a high level, on a population level, that, these population responses in both artificial and biological networks behave similarly. Of course, this work is at its infancy. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to actually make a strong statement that, let's say, what actually is happening on an artificial neural network is similar to what is happening on a biological neural network. Because as someone with a neuroscience background, I can say for sure that neuroscience or a biological neural network is a super complex system. It is very difficult to comprehend it as of today when it starts actually functioning in a highly active state, let's say, right? And on the other hand, artificial neural networks is, I mean, we do understand them to a great extent. There is still a part which people are trying to understand, that why they work so nicely, but the underlying maths behind it, I think we as a community, as a machine learning community, actually understand quite some. Now, can we actually draw a similarity that what those equations are, the way artificial neural networks are working? Is it something similar to what the biological neural networks are working? I would say maybe like 1% of it, maybe 2% of it, maybe 10% of it. But in order for us to actually try to explain the 100% or try to capture the 100% complexity of a biological neural network, we need to define certain rules to qualify an artificial neural network that behaves similar to a biological neural network, right? So one of those rules has to be that, let's say, both of these networks and biological and artificial networks should have individual units, such as neurons, which not only capture the functionality on a high level or a population level, but on a single neuron level as well. So if, let's say, I go to a single neuron in an artificial neural network, which I can define as a single neuron in a biological neural network, they should be mimicking each other, let's say. Now, some people may argue and say, what, maybe the individual neuron's functionality does not matter that much. What matters most is, the high-level functionality, which needs to be achieved. For sure, you can say that, right? But then that neural network is not 100% capturing the complexity of the biological neural network, right? Of course not. And then the other layer to it, as one of the defining rules that we can draw, is the types of neurons that are there, right? So we know in our brain we have excitatory neurons, we have inhibitory neurons, for instance, and a wide variety of them. Then artificial neural network must be able to mimic those computational rules inside that network while it is learning and running on inference. Now, if we have those as two bases, then we can actually, it sets an amazing sort of like test stage for us to actually test so many theories, right? And now neuroscience have matured enough that we can validate those theories to a good extent. For instance, there are techniques such as brain-wide recordings from neurons, from individual neurons actually, and there are electric probes as well, which people actually insert in animals' brain. For instance, they put it inside mice brain, and they record from thousands of neurons simultaneously while presenting certain stimulus. Could it be, let's say, in case of mice, for instance, you could like stimulate the whisker. It's a perfect system in mice to actually study, and you could actually present images as well. Now, imagine such a test set where we could actually make an artificial neural network which has the same biological basis, right, in terms of anatomy and computational level. And then when presented a new stimulus, or when presented a new task, it behaves similar to what we actually record from the mice brain or from the animal's brain, right? Let's say. Now, if those responses are similar to what the responses of artificial neurons would look like, right, then one can say, you know, where we actually have made an artificial neural network that is perfectly similar to biological neural network. Right? But I think we as a field, from both perspectives, machine learning and neuroscience, are quite far as of today from reaching that level. One of the reasons is that it's not easy to do experiments with animal and collecting some large-scale data. It's not straightforward. And then the environmental conditions needs to be absolutely the same, right, when you are recording the data. And with the artificial neural networks as well, most of the networks today actually that are outperforming on real-world tasks, whether those are vision and auditory and other examples, they take some inspiration from biological neural networks, as we discussed earlier, but they don't take too much inspiration from the biological neural networks, actually. And what they rely most on is actually large-scale data sets when we think about supervised learning. In that sense, what they actually try to rely more is actually try to solve it for a specific task. Just make a network which is perfect for, let's say, object classification. What that network needs, images with labels. Okay, let's collect that data. Train a model, it's working fine. Let's push it off for, you know, application in the industries, right? Now, in the machine learning community, there isn't much motivation, if you think about it, to actually try to understand what's happening in the brain, right? Now, neuroscience community has a lot of inspiration. They would really like to do that. They would like to amazingly build a model and a neural network that would explain what is happening in the brain. But then they actually lack expertise from the machine learning community as well, right? Because where machine learning has actually grown so far is actually making these amazing models and, you know, learning the best data and training those models. Whereas neuroscience community has been more focused towards actually collecting the data from biological neurons, from animals, and try to understand some basic principles without applying too much machine learning. But there is hope, right? As an optimistic, I would say, like now there is a lot of synergy happening And we will hopefully be able to see more interesting deep neural networks in the near future that we can say, on some benchmark level that is very close to, for instance, visual cortex of mice or human, or the auditory cortex, and those models could be different, right? So there is a different network for auditory cortex, there is a different network for visual cortex, and so on. So it is happening. I think it is there that it's starting to happen.
So using deep reinforcement learning, an AI algorithm can be taught how to learn to interact with humans and learn how humans function. Some of the methods, like you might know, are self-play, population play, behavioral cloning play, fictitious co-play. Can you talk about this? I mean, how easy or difficult it is to do this when you're dealing with these AI algorithms to teach this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think so. There is a lot of work recently done in deep reinforcement learning. As I said earlier, reinforcement learning has been out there since a while, but there is this new term called deep reinforcement learning, which we hear a lot these days. Thanks to DeepMind, we have been working a lot on this subject. More interestingly, actually, what brought the attention of the world towards this topic is actually when they made these amazing models, which, for instance, AlphaGo, which beat the best Go player in the world.
Yeah.
And more recently, they actually introduced AlphaFold, which is actually to predict protein structure in 3D. Now, in terms of high-level concept, when we talk about deep reinforcement learning, as like the difference between traditional reinforcement learning, which is actually, you can think of like an artificial agent, which is trying to learn from its environment through some rewards, right? So should I take right or should I take left is decided by an agent based on the reward that you have in the environment. So there is some state space, right, where an agent can navigate in the environment based on the reward while it is interacting with the external environment. Now, in deep reinforcement learning, what is interesting is now typical deep neural networks are very good in actually learning features from large-scale data and then making predictions, right? Whereas if you think of like what that artificial agent was doing in a traditional reinforcement learning task, was actually learning some state space, and then be able to make the predictions like which stage to go in. Now, what they actually did, they actually changed that. They replaced that part with a very high-performing deep neural networks. Now, an artificial agent is able to learn that state space through very powerful neural network, right? And then, boom, we see these amazing performances of deep neural learning tasks. And in that sense, one of the common examples is which you are pointing as examples is like using deep reinforcement learning to interact with us as individuals or as a group of people, in different examples or different applications. I think it is happening a lot. Like, for instance, one of the major applications of reinforcement learning today is gaming industry, where while we are interacting with like the computer as player, and then we are able to actually deal with like a very smart player, which is like an artificial agent that actually behaves quite similar to what we believe is as an intelligent being should be. And the way this artificial agent is learning these things is actually learning from us. They look at our decisions, the way we actually take decisions in the games, from one player, from hundreds of players, from thousands of players, and then try to make the best inference, best predictions from those experiences. And this could happen, as I just said, like from a single player level, right? You could just have an artificial agent that just learn from you, or there could be, let's say, an artificial agent that learns from a group of people, right? Or let's say when we are talking about games, such as where a lot of other big sort of like players are actually playing the game simultaneously, right?
Right.
Now, The interesting thing is that we were lacking that human experience when we were actually playing with these virtual games, right? And deep reinforcement learning is actually providing that human experience, right? It is providing that natural experience to it, right?
Right.
And this is just about, let's say, gaming experience when we talk about experiences. But in terms of like applications, right? Whenever we think of like any task where there is certain reward value that we can associate with, which is almost everything in life, right? We always have certain rewards when we think of our actions. Then deep reinforcement learning is an obvious choice of a model to actually learn from such data and be able to make predictions, right? And those predictions could be on a single level, right? So such systems could be individual specific, and such systems could be group specific, population specific, nation specific as well. Right? I'm really curious to see what deep reinforcement learning is going to be providing in the near future.
So AI today can now match human intelligence in terms of object recognition, outperforming humans in games, like you said, AlphaGo and Atari. It can now create great paintings using neural art. Can talk precisely like humans in the same voice, and more of that kind of stuff. So, however, there are a lot of things that AI still needs to match the human intelligence. So then, how does neuroscience help in doing this for AI?
I think it's a very good question. I think you can imagine like all of these tasks that you just mentioned, like vision-based tasks and or audition or speech-based tasks, and all of these are the tasks that we understand very commonly because there is a lot of applications to it that we use. We do these tasks in our day-to-day activities, and since we do it on day-to-day activities, our brains are actually tuned to these tasks as well, and our neurons are actually tuned to actually perform these tasks as well.
Right.
Now, you can imagine like there are some tasks in which AI is already performing or outperforming humans, where, especially for tasks where you need to actually train from a large amount of data sets to be able to make predictions, especially from complex data sets, to be able to make predictions, right? For instance, one of the examples that I gave earlier was, let's say if you want to diagnose a certain disease by looking at some information of a patient's file, right? And this today is done by, a very trained diagnostician who actually have seen thousands and thousands of similar cases in his or her life, and then be able to make a prediction, right? Now, with AI today, you can actually take that doctor's data as label and then hundreds of other similar doctors' data and then train a powerful model, which can, in theory, definitely outperform a single individual medical diagnostician, right? And in that sense, I think AI is already very smart and it doesn't need much sort of like motivation from us or from neuroscience to actually be able to become more robust. But there are some other tasks, several tasks in which help from neuroscience can definitely come very handy. And one of those tasks is, for instance, now there is a lot of problem of like that these models are data hungry. Right? They need millions of examples to actually make a single prediction. And now the question is, how many examples do we need, to actually classify a face, right? Chances are that we do not need much examples to actually classify a face as a face, or a car as a car, or or a water bottle as a water bottle. And then there is this new emerging field which is in deep learning called self-supervised learning, which is just take minimum examples, right, for supervision, and then itself the model can learn from the data to actually be able to make nice predictions, right?
Right.
And in that sense, and there is another field, which is the subfield of this, which is called one-shot learning or zero-shot learning, where you only need one sample from a different data to be able to make like robust predictions, a human-level prediction, let's say, for a new task. And zero-shot learning is even progressive, which means you don't need any examples, as a label data, and you can still outperform for a new task through a network.
Right.
In that sense, I think we humans are pretty good at, right? Because let's say we have driven a car in a street in London, and then we actually go to drive in a street in, let's say, New York. I don't think we need to take so many examples to be able to actually drive a car. We will just naturally start doing it. And in that sense, I think so we are very good in this sort of like one-shot learning, zero-shot learning, right? Because we have learned from a specific data modality, right? Let's say from experiences from our driving in London. And then we can actually apply directly to a new task, which is similar task, but with a very different data modality, let's say, relatively. Now, in that sense, I think there is quite some work that is happening in AI, which is like domain adaptation, domain generalization, for instance, where you try to actually take data from multiple domains for different tasks and then try to generalize your models, right? Now, our brains actually are pretty smart in making those amazing generalized features, right? Because when we learn from our environment or from our, let's take vision as an example, our brains are pretty good in learning some generalized features, right? And if we take that learning principle as an inspiration and try to mimic that into sort of like artificial neural networks, then chances are that we do not need many examples to train a model, right? We need just a few examples, or maybe like we can lead towards zero-shot learning, right? That is one large example of where AI could be benefited. And then there are several other fronts, I believe. We can keep talking about it. But for instance, on top of my head, one amazing task that we humans are able to do perfectly, which AI is catching up on, is be able to actually take multiple modalities of data simultaneously and process it to make a decision. Right. So, for instance, we take the vision as an input, we take audition as an input, we take olfaction as an input, and other sensory experiences, and then we are able to make some very smart and robust decisions in real time. Whereas when it comes to AI, then you need to make a dedicated model for each different data modality, and then try to make like an ensemble network of these, and then make a joint training of these networks by having a labeled data, which has an olfactory score, which has a vision score, which has such data sets. I don't even know if they exist actually, by the way. So making such data itself a problem, let alone try to benchmark on those tasks. I think their neuroscience would be taken as a huge inspiration, right, for multimodal data sets. And I think our brain is very perfect if you think about several tasks, actually. And as I started answering your first question was, that back in like 60s, some neuroscientists discovered some kinds of cells which today are the basis of these deep neural networks, right? And I think they just scratched the surface of the brain. And you can imagine, like, if you just scratch the surface of the brain, then you can have like a multi-trillion-dollar industry standing today, which is AI. And what happens if you scratch it a little more, right? So I believe there is a lot to learn from neuroscience, which we can apply in AI and for the benefit of the society as a whole in the future.
Great point to conclude that answer. Because like our theme of the podcast was AI and neuroscience are sort of married to each other, and both of them will benefit amazingly in the future and can help build human-like intelligence. Using neuroscience. I also talk about philosophy. Sometimes is also very important in sort of creating those rules and models for general intelligence to be created. So I think it's a great answer, and I have exhausted my questions, Asim. Really had a great time talking to you. Before we wrap up, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, it was a great experience, Vivek. I think the topic was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I think topics like these should be discussed more often. And I think what you are covering in your podcast are those amazing topics. And I really wish you all the best with it. So thanks a lot again for giving me the opportunity to come here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Asim. I had really great fun today and really learned a lot from you. And I'm pretty sure whoever will be listening to it will also benefit a lot. So depending on your schedule, we will again plan something in the future and talk about some more topics in neuroscience and AI.
Definitely. It will
Yeah.
be my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Asim. Have a great day.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please support this podcast by liking, commenting, sharing it with your friends, and also subscribing to this channel. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.